Prejudiced cops arrest black woman without cause, face unexpected justice. A biased officer detains a woman without justification, assuming she's just another ordinary citizen. What he doesn't realize is that she's actually an undercover federal agent, a revelation that will upend his career and life. If you're ready for a gripping tale of truth and accountability, make sure to follow our journey. Let's dive into the story. Officer Brian Miller adjusted his cap as he slowly cruised through the streets of Meadowview, his patrol car purring steadily in the fading evening light. This neighborhood was one he believed he understood like the back of his hand, rows of modest homes, small bustling shops, and groups of locals hanging out on street corners. To Miller, these were often signs of trouble waiting to happen. His job, as he saw it, was to stop trouble in its tracks before it had the chance to unfold. As Miller passed a small parking lot near a neighborhood deli, his eyes fell on a sleek silver car parked in isolation. A woman with deep brown skin and sharp features sat in the driver's seat, scrolling on her phone. The scene itself wasn't suspicious, but something about it didn't sit right with Miller. "She's been here too long," he muttered to himself, pulling his patrol car to a stop at the curb. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the steering wheel as he mulled over his next move. Probably waiting for something, or someone. Stepping out of the patrol car, his boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the vehicle. The woman, Nicole Harper, noticed him immediately and rolled down her window, her composed demeanor hinting at both awareness and readiness. "Good evening, officer." "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone measured and polite. Miller folded his arms and leaned closer to the window, his eyes scanning the interior of the car. "That depends," he replied, his voice laced with suspicion. "What are you doing here?" Nicole raised an eyebrow and set her phone down on the passenger seat. "I'm waiting for a friend," she said evenly. "Is that an issue?" Her calm reply took Miller off guard. Most people in her position, he thought, would stumble over their words or rush to explain themselves. Her poised manner felt like a challenge to his authority. "Do you have ID?" Miller asked, his tone sharpening. Nicole maintained her composure. "Unless I'm being accused of something, I don't believe I need to show you my ID," she said firmly. Her reply made Miller bristle. To him, it felt like defiance, and defiance was something he couldn't tolerate. "Look," he said, his voice rising, "I'm just trying to figure out what's going on here. If you're not going to cooperate, that's on you." "I am cooperating," Nicole responded, her tone unchanging. "But I do have a right to ask why you're stopping me. What exactly is the reason?" Miller hesitated, glancing around to find a few onlookers peeking out from behind windows and pulling out their phones. He hated how quickly bystanders jumped to conclusions in this era of instant recordings and viral videos. "You look suspicious sitting here," he blurted, attempting to justify his actions. Nicole's expression hardened, but her voice remained cool. "Suspicious for sitting in my car? Don't make this harder than it has to be," Miller snapped, moving closer to her vehicle. "Step out of the car." Nicole sighed, unfastened her seatbelt, and slowly stepped out, moving with deliberate calm. As she stood beside her car, Miller launched into a barrage of questions. "Where are you coming from? What are you doing here? Who's this friend you're waiting for?" Nicole crossed her arms, her eyes locked on his. "I've already told you everything you need to know. I'm waiting for someone." "That's not a crime." The gathering onlookers began murmuring amongst themselves, and more phones appeared, recording the unfolding scene. Miller felt their eyes on him, judgmental and unwelcome. "You're resisting," he declared abruptly. "Resisting what?" Nicole asked, her confusion evident. Without another word, Miller reached for his handcuffs. "Turn around." "You're under arrest," he said, his voice filled with misplaced authority. Nicole's gaze sharpened, but she didn't resist. As the cold steel snapped around her wrists, she said calmly, "Officer, I really think you're making a mistake." Miller smirked as he led her to the patrol car, the sense of power filling his chest. He slammed the door behind her, glancing smugly at the small crowd that had gathered. What he didn't realize was that his actions had just set the stage for the biggest mistake of his career. People deserve to be treated with respect by those entrusted to protect them. With that, Nicole Harper turned and walked away, leaving Officer Brian Miller in stunned silence. The full weight of his actions began to settle in, heavy and suffocating. The low murmurs of the station grew louder, but Miller couldn't focus on them. All he could think was, "What have I done?" The usual noise of the station faded, but an unspoken tension hung in the air like an accusation no one dared to voice. Miller sat at his desk, staring at the paperwork in front of him, but his mind raced. The words federal agent echoed repeatedly, chipping away at the confidence he'd felt earlier. The slam of Captain Richard Brooks's office door jolted Miller from his thoughts. He looked up to see Brooks standing there, his expression cold and barely containing his fury. "Miller." Brooks snapped, his voice sharp and commanding. "My office. Now." Miller froze, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Reluctantly, he stood and trudged toward the office, his footsteps heavy with a sense of impending doom. Once inside, Brooks motioned for him to shut the door, then crossed his arms over his chest. "What the hell were you thinking?" Brooks demanded, his voice low but seething with intensity. "Captain, I didn't know," Miller began, but Brooks cut him off with an abrupt wave of his hand. "Enough," Brooks said firmly, leaving no room for excuses. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to ask. Do you even realize the mess you've caused this department? That woman isn't just any agent, she's a senior investigator with the Bureau. Do you understand how serious this is?" Miller's face paled. "Senior investigator," he repeated, his voice barely audible. Brooks nodded grimly. "That's right. And she's already made her first move. I just got off the phone with the Bureau's regional director. They want a full report by the end of the day." Miller's throat tightened, and his mouth felt dry. "I thought she looked suspicious," he muttered weakly. "Suspicious?" Brooks repeated, his voice rising. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to make snap judgments about people sitting in their cars. What exactly made her suspicious?" Miller had no answer. He shifted uneasily, avoiding Brooks's piercing gaze. Brooks let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. "Do you even understand how lucky you are that she didn't escalate this on the spot? She could have shown you her badge while you were cuffing her. But she didn't." Brooks's tone hardened as he continued. "Do you know why? Because she's 100 times the professional you'll ever be." Miller clenched his fists at his sides, Brooks's words hitting harder than he wanted to admit. "She's filing a report," Brooks said coldly. "And let me be clear, this isn't going away. The Bureau doesn't take these things lightly, and neither does the media. Or did you not notice all the phones pointed at you tonight?" Miller's stomach churned. He had seen the phones. He just hadn't cared, until now. The sharp ring of the station phone cut through the tense silence. Brooks snatched the receiver, his expression growing darker as he listened. "Yes, this is Captain Brooks," he said, his voice low and serious. A pause followed, his jaw tightening as the conversation continued. "Understood. I'll make sure the officer is available for questioning." Brooks ended the call and turned to Miller, his tone chillingly calm. "That was the Bureau. They're sending someone to conduct an internal review. They want to speak to you directly." Miller's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" he stammered. "It means," Brooks replied with icy calm, "you'd better pray they don't decide to make an example of you. Now, get out of my office and start writing your report. Every detail, every decision. Leave nothing out." Miller turned and left the office, each step feeling heavier than the last. The station seemed eerily quiet, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. As he sat at his desk, staring blankly at the incident report, he realized this wasn't just about one arrest. It was about everything he had ever done in his career. The weight of what was about to happen was overwhelming. Officer Brian Miller sat at his desk, staring at the blank incident report in front of him as if it were a challenge he couldn't face. His mind swirled with regret, panic, and denial. He replayed every moment of the arrest, trying to justify his actions, telling himself he had done the right thing. But deep down, he knew the truth: he had acted on assumptions, not facts. The sharp sound of the station doors opening snapped him out of his thoughts. Looking up, he saw two men in suits striding confidently into the room. One of them was the same agent who had escorted Nicole Harper earlier, and the other was unfamiliar, a tall, broad-shouldered man radiating authority. The station seemed to hold its collective breath as the two approached Captain Richard Brooks's office. Brooks stepped out to meet them, his face a mixture of concern and professionalism. "Agent Walker." "Agent Diaz," Brooks greeted them, shaking their hands. "Thank you for coming." Walker, the taller of the two, nodded briskly. "We need to speak with Officer Miller." Brooks motioned toward Miller's desk. Every gaze in the room shifted to him as the agents walked in his direction. Miller felt their weight, the judgment of his colleagues, as he stood and tried to appear calm. Inside, though, his nerves were on edge. "Officer Miller," Walker said, his voice firm but calm. "We need to ask you some questions. Can we speak privately?" Miller nodded, his throat dry, and led them to an empty interrogation room. Each step felt heavier than the last. Once inside, Walker closed the door and placed a folder on the table. Diaz remained standing, his sharp eyes locked on Miller. "Officer Miller," Walker began, settling into the chair across from him. "Do you understand how serious your actions were last night?" Miller hesitated, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know she was a federal agent." "If you had known..." Walker interrupted, raising a hand. "This isn't about her being an agent. It's about why you decided to arrest her in the first place," Diaz added, his tone cutting. "Walk us through your decision-making." Miller's throat tightened. "She was sitting in her car outside a closed store. It looked suspicious. Did you ask her why she was there?" Diaz pressed, his voice sharp and unrelenting. "No," Miller admitted, shaking his head. "But I assumed." "You assumed," Walker interjected, his tone hardening. He opened the folder and slid it across the table, revealing a photo. "This is Nicole Harper," he said, tapping the image. "She's one of the Bureau's top investigators, working on cases involving organized crime, human trafficking, and corruption. And last night, you treated her like a common criminal. Why? Because she didn't fit the image of who you thought belonged in that neighborhood?" Miller's face turned red. "I wasn't profiling her." "Yes, you were," Walker shot back, his calm demeanor cracking. "And the worst part? You didn't even do your job properly. You didn't ask questions, didn't verify her identity. You went straight to the handcuffs because it was easier to flex your authority than to think critically." Miller's heart raced. "I didn't mean to." "Intent doesn't matter," Diaz cut in, leaning forward. "The impact does. And the impact of your actions could have lasting consequences, for you, for this department, and for the public's trust in law enforcement." Walker continued, his voice icy. "Do you know why Agent Harper didn't immediately identify herself? She wanted to see how far you'd push this, and you failed every test." Miller's stomach churned. He opened his mouth to speak, but Walker wasn't finished. "She recorded the entire interaction. The Bureau has it. So does the media." Miller's head spun. The media. He hadn't even considered that angle. Diaz gave a curt nod. "You'll be hearing from them soon. But first, you'll answer to us." The Bureau doesn't tolerate its agents being mistreated, especially not when it's driven by bias. Miller slouched in his chair, the enormity of his actions crashing down on him. His career, his reputation, everything was unraveling before his eyes. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Walker asked, his voice thick with disappointment. Miller opened his mouth, but no words came. What could he possibly say? The truth was undeniable and stung deeply. He hadn't judged Nicole for what she did but for who she was. And now he was paying the price. As Walker and Diaz left the room, the full weight of Miller's decisions sank in. He sat alone in the silence of the interrogation room, the reality of his actions pressing down on him. For years, his career had felt untouchable, fueled by his unwavering belief in his authority. But now, it was crumbling. When he finally left the room, he avoided the judgmental stares of his colleagues. Whispers filled the air, alive with speculation. Miller trudged back to his desk, the tension in the room palpable. Captain Brooks approached, dropping a stack of papers onto Miller's desk with a sharp thud. "Here," he said, his voice curt. "Your suspension notice." Miller's heart skipped a beat. "Suspension," he stammered. "Count yourself lucky," Brooks snapped, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It's just a suspension," Captain Richard Brooks interrupted, his voice low but simmering with anger. "The Bureau is giving us some time to sort this out before they escalate it further. But don't get too comfortable, this is only going to get worse." Brian Miller swallowed hard. "Worse how?" he asked, his voice strained with anxiety. Brooks shot him a glare that could freeze steel. "Do you have any idea who Agent Harper is?" he asked sharply. "She's not just any agent, she's highly respected, not only within the Bureau but across law enforcement agencies nationwide." Miller's face turned ashen. "You didn't just arrest a federal agent," Brooks continued. "You disrespected someone with real influence. One phone call from her, and your career could be over." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "And with the footage she has, she doesn't even need to make that call." The words hit Miller like a sledgehammer. He nodded stiffly, his throat dry and unable to respond. Brooks turned and left the room, leaving Miller alone to grapple with the gravity of his situation. The shrill ring of his desk phone shattered the silence, jolting him. He hesitated for a moment, then picked it up. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice attempting steadiness but tinged with unease. "Mr. Miller," came the calm but firm voice on the other end. "This is David Pratt with Internal Affairs. We've received a formal request from the Bureau to investigate your actions. We'll be reviewing body cam footage, witness statements, and Agent Harper's recording. Expect us to follow up shortly." Miller's stomach churned as he replied softly, "Understood." As the call ended, he leaned back in his chair, the full weight of the unfolding disaster settling over him. Each passing moment made the reality of his predicament sharper and more crushing. By midday, the story had spread like wildfire, making headlines in local news outlets. A crowd of reporters gathered outside the police station, their cameras trained on the entrance. Headlines dominated the airwaves and internet. Local officer arrests FBI agent in shocking profiling incident, FBI agent records arrest on video, police department faces racism accusations. Miller's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and messages. Friends, old acquaintances, and distant relatives reached out, some offering sympathy, but most demanding explanations. He ignored them all, the shame too overwhelming to confront. The hardest moment came when his wife, Laura, called. "I just saw the news," she said, her voice shaking. "Brian, what is happening?" He exhaled deeply, massaging his temples. "It's complicated," he muttered. "Complicated?" she snapped. "People are calling you a racist. Is that who you are? Is that what you've been hiding from me?" "It's not like that," he protested weakly, but the uncertainty in his voice made the words feel hollow. Then explain it to me, she demanded, her voice breaking. That evening, as Miller left the station, reporters swarmed him, firing rapid questions. "Officer Miller, do you believe the arrest was racially motivated?" one shouted. "Did you know she was an FBI agent when you arrested her?" asked another. "Do you regret what you did?" Miller kept his head down, refusing to answer. The barrage of questions followed him all the way to his car. The flash of cameras in his rearview mirror served as a harsh reminder, this was just the beginning. While Miller struggled to come to terms with the fallout, Nicole Harper was already back in her element at the FBI's regional office. The incident had become a hot topic among her colleagues, but Harper was unfazed. She had bigger issues to tackle, ones far beyond the actions of one misguided officer. At her desk, Nicole Harper sifted through a mountain of case files. For months, she had been tracking a powerful organized crime syndicate that was growing bolder with each passing day. Time was running out, but Nicole's determination was unwavering. Despite the setback caused by Officer Brian Miller's actions, she was ready to press forward. Her mission was far too important to be derailed. Nicole had faced tougher challenges in her career, and she wasn't about to let this incident throw her off course. As she reviewed her notes, Agent Walker entered her office, holding a folder. "Nicole," he began, his tone measured. "I spoke to Internal Affairs. They're taking this seriously. Miller has been suspended, and they're pushing for swift disciplinary action." Nicole leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. "Good," she said flatly. "But let's not lose sight of the bigger picture." Walker raised an eyebrow, sensing there was more. "You mean the case?" Nicole nodded. "That's my priority. This operation goes far beyond one officer's mistake. Lives are at stake, families to save. I won't let this get in the way." Walker studied her for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "You're remarkably calm about all of this." Nicole offered him a faint, knowing smile. "You've known me long enough to understand. Calm doesn't mean indifferent. It means I'm thinking ahead." Outwardly composed, Nicole was battling a storm inside. The incident with Miller wasn't just about her arrest, it was a glaring reminder of the systemic issues she had dedicated her life to combating. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had faced countless microaggressions and moments of open hostility, but this was different. It was blatant, public, and personal. She opened her laptop and began drafting a report for her superiors. Her words were precise, detailing the events of her arrest while addressing the broader implications for the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they were sworn to protect. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her focus. It was her mentor, former FBI Director Linda Graves. "Nicole," Linda greeted warmly. "I heard about what happened. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," Nicole replied, her tone steady. "It's not the first time I've faced something like this, and it won't be the last." Linda's voice softened, filled with concern. "I know. But you've always handled these situations with such grace. What's your next move?" "I've submitted my report," Nicole said, taking a deep breath. "I've made it clear that the officer's actions were completely unacceptable. But for now, I need to stay focused on the job. This case is too critical." Linda chuckled lightly, admiration evident in her tone. "You've always been so focused, Nicole. But don't forget, you have the power to make a real difference here. Don't let this moment slip by." Nicole's expression hardened, her resolve strengthening. "I won't," she replied firmly. By the end of the day, Nicole was back with her team, preparing for the next phase of their operation. The syndicate they were targeting had been trafficking vulnerable individuals across state lines, exploiting systemic gaps to evade law enforcement. Nicole had spent months undercover, gathering evidence, and now they were ready to act. "Tomorrow morning, we move in," Nicole told her team, her voice steady and commanding. "We shut down their operation. No loose ends." The team nodded, their determination mirroring her own. As they finalized their plans, Nicole felt a renewed sense of purpose. The last 48 hours had been frustrating, but they reminded her of the deeper reason she pursued justice, not just for the victims of crime but for those who faced systemic injustices daily. That evening, as Nicole reviewed the final details of the raid, an email from her boss appeared in her inbox. Attached was a formal apology from the police department and an update on the ongoing investigation into Officer Miller's behavior. She closed the email without responding. Forgiveness would take time, there was still much to be done. The next day, Nicole led the operation with precision, successfully dismantling the syndicate. Yet, even as the mission ended in triumph, the weight of her recent arrest lingered. Sitting at her desk late that night, she reflected on the faces of those she had saved and the many others still beyond reach. The incident with Miller served as a stark reminder of the systemic change that was desperately needed. Nicole had always fought for justice, but now she realized her fight must extend beyond individual cases. It had to include the institutions themselves, their policies, their culture, and their biases. Miller's suspension and the internal investigation were just the beginning. Real change required more than disciplinary action. It required a fundamental shift in how law enforcement engaged with the communities they served, especially marginalized communities. Nicole began drafting a proposal for the Bureau, outlining steps for meaningful reform, mandatory training to challenge biases, leadership accountability, and a commitment to building trust with the public. Her hands trembled slightly as she sent the proposal to her superiors. This wasn't just about pursuing criminals, it was about reshaping the culture of law enforcement. As the email left her inbox, Nicole thought back to the day she had been arrested. The judgment she had faced based solely on her appearance had been a painful reminder of how much work remained. But she refused to let that moment define her. Instead, she chose to let it fuel her determination.